Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening.
Officer, on what grounds?
The detector didn't alert.
Explain the cause.
It's a random check. Cooperate.
The security checkpoint alarm hadn't even stopped ringing when Judge Marcus Williams felt it. His life was about to change forever. Standing there in his perfectly pressed navy blue suit, briefcase firmly in his hand, he watched 3 airport security officers walk toward him. The looks on their faces sent a chill straight through his body. What those officers didn't know was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. A mistake that would uncover a deep and ugly network of corruption, racial bias, and abuse of power, far bigger than anyone could have imagined. Judge Marcus Williams was 52 years old and had spent the past 15 years serving on the bench. In the legal world, his name carried weight. He was known as a no-nonsense judge who ran his courtroom with strict control. Defense attorneys respected him. Prosecutors were careful around him. Criminals knew that standing before Judge Williams meant a serious battle. He had built his reputation on being tough but fair, never giving special treatment because of race, wealth, or personal connections. That Tuesday morning in November, Judge Williams was heading to a judicial conference in another state. His flight was early, so he arrived at the airport around 6:30 a.m. The terminal was quiet, with only a few business travelers and early commuters moving through security. This was nothing new for him. He had taken this same trip dozens of times and knew the routine well. He placed his briefcase and shoes into the plastic bins, walked through the metal detector, and waited calmly on the other side for his belongings. That's when Officer Danny Rodriguez noticed something. It wasn't anything suspicious about Judge Williams' behavior or his items. Instead, it triggered a different kind of reaction altogether. Rodriguez had worked in airport security for 8 years. He saw himself as experienced, professional, and thorough. What he didn't see himself as was especially sharp when it came to reading people. If he had been, he might have noticed the quiet confidence in Judge Williams' posture. He might have seen the expensive watch, the high-quality suit, or the leather briefcase that cost more than Rodriguez earned in a month. But he didn't. All Rodriguez saw was a well-dressed black man traveling alone through his checkpoint. Rodriguez called over his supervisor, Janet Pierce, a woman who had been running security at that checkpoint for more than 10 years. Pierce took one look at Judge Williams and gave a small nod to Rodriguez. No words were exchanged, but both officers knew exactly what was about to happen. It was a routine they had carried out countless times before. Judge Williams had just picked up his briefcase and was putting his shoes back on when Officer Rodriguez walked up to him and asked him to step aside for additional screening. Williams looked up, confused but not alarmed. He calmly asked if there was an issue with his luggage or if he had forgotten to remove something from his pockets. Rodriguez didn't answer directly. He simply repeated that additional screening was required. This was the moment the story took its first dramatic turn. Unlike many others who had been targeted by these officers before, Judge Williams didn't quietly go along. He wasn't nervous or shaken. Instead, he did something Rodriguez and Pierce had never experienced before. He started asking questions. The right ones? Williams asked what exactly had triggered the extra screening. He asked if his luggage had tested positive for any prohibited substances. He asked whether the metal detector had shown any problem. Rodriguez struggled to respond. His answers were unclear, and it was obvious he wasn't prepared for someone who actually understood how security rules worked. Judge Williams then asked to speak with a supervisor. Rodriguez pointed toward Pierce, who was standing nearby and had been listening the entire time. Williams walked over to Pierce and introduced himself, polite but firm. He explained that he traveled often, that nothing about his screening had been unusual, and that he wanted to understand why he was being singled out. Pierce's response would later become the center of the entire controversy. She told him his selection for additional screening was completely random. When Judge Williams pointed out that at least 6 other passengers had passed through the same metal detector without any extra screening, Pierce became defensive. She claimed that questioning security procedures was, in itself, suspicious behavior. Judge Williams stayed calm, but anyone who knew him well would have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. It was the same look he gave in court when a lawyer tried to use illegally obtained evidence or when a witness lied under oath. It was the look of a man trained to spot deception, and now he was seeing it used against him. Pierce confirmed that the interaction was being recorded, though the regret showed on her face almost instantly after she said it. Right then, Officer Rodriguez returned holding a handheld metal detection wand. He told Judge Williams to spread his arms and legs for a pat-down search. Williams followed the instruction without resistance, but he also did something unexpected. He pulled out his phone and started recording. The moment the camera appeared, the entire situation changed. Pierce immediately ordered Williams to put his phone away, claiming that recording security procedures was not allowed. Williams stayed calm. He explained that they were in a public area of the airport and that he had the legal right to record his own interaction with public officials. He added that if airport security was uncomfortable with transparency, then maybe their procedures needed to be questioned. Rodriguez completed the pat-down and, just as expected, found nothing. He then stated that Judge Williams' briefcase would need to be searched by hand. Williams watched silently as Rodriguez opened the briefcase and removed each item one by one. Legal papers, a laptop, pens, business cards, and finally a small leather portfolio holding his judicial credentials. When Rodriguez opened the portfolio, his expression changed instantly. The color drained from his face as he saw Judge Williams' judicial identification card. In that moment, he realized exactly who he had been treating like a suspect for the past 10 minutes. He quickly showed the card to Pierce, whose annoyed expression shifted into something close to panic. But instead of apologizing and ending the search, Pierce made a surprising choice. She doubled down. She loudly stated that judicial credentials did not exempt anyone from security screening and that the process would continue regardless of Williams' position. She made sure other passengers could hear her, as if proving she wasn't afraid of his title. Judge Williams closed his eyes briefly and took a slow, deep breath. Then he made a decision that would change everything. He chose not to pull rank. He didn't demand special treatment. He didn't use his authority to stop the harassment. Instead, he let it continue. He wanted to see how far they would go. More importantly, he wanted to document everything. He suspected that what was happening to him had happened to many other travelers, people who didn't have his legal knowledge, his resources, or his ability to fight back. What Judge Williams didn't yet know was that his instinct was completely right. This wasn't a one-time mistake or overzealous security. It was part of a long-standing pattern of racial profiling that targeted successful Black travelers who dared to look confident and well-off while flying. Pierce instructed Rodriguez to conduct an even more thorough search. She wanted every document examined, every pocket of the briefcase checked, and every electronic device inspected. Williams stood patiently, his phone still recording, as the officers pushed past every rule of reasonable security screening. Rodriguez pulled out Williams' laptop and announced it needed to be powered on. Williams complied, entered his password, and watched as Rodriguez scrolled through the desktop. The officer opened multiple files, including confidential court documents and case notes related to active legal proceedings. This crossed a serious line, one that even Pierce seemed to recognize. She quietly told Rodriguez to close the laptop, but the damage had already been done. Judge Williams had just witnessed officers accessing privileged judicial materials and attorney-client information without any legal authority. The search continued for another 15 minutes. Other passengers began to gather. Some recorded on their own phones. Others simply watched in disbelief. A well-dressed Black man was being treated in a way no other traveler nearby was experiencing. The optics were terrible, and Pierce knew it, but she seemed trapped in the situation she had created. Rodriguez found nothing because there was nothing to find. Judge Williams was exactly who he appeared to be, a respected federal judge traveling to a professional conference with nothing more dangerous than legal documents and a laptop. When the search finally ended, Pierce handed back his belongings with what could barely be called an apology. She said the screening was complete and that he was free to go. There was no explanation for why he had been selected, no acknowledgement of how invasive the search had been, no recognition that an innocent traveler had just been harassed for 20 minutes. Judge Williams carefully packed his briefcase, taking his time. His flight was boarding, but he wasn't in a rush anymore. He had something more important to do. He approached Pierce one last time and asked for the contact information of her supervisor. She hesitated, then gave him the name and phone number of the airport security director. Williams also requested incident report forms and asked how to obtain copies of the security footage. Pierce's attitude shifted again. She became defensive and asked why he needed all of this information. Judge Williams smiled for the first time since the encounter began. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the calm, knowing smile of someone who had just identified a serious weakness. He told Pierce that he planned to file a formal complaint about their conduct. He said he found their procedures questionable and their explanations lacking. He explained that he intended to review the incident carefully to see whether any policies or laws had been broken. What he didn't tell her was that he had already identified at least 6 possible federal violations: unlawful search and seizure, violation of attorney-client privilege, racial discrimination, abuse of authority, and that was only from the first 10 minutes of their interaction. Williams missed his flight, of course, but he didn't look worried about it at all. Instead of rushing to his gate, he spent the next hour in the airport making one phone call after another. First, he called his assistant and told her to reschedule his conference appearances. Then he called a colleague who specialized in civil rights law. After that, he contacted the Media Relations Office of the Federal Judiciary. By the time he boarded a later flight that afternoon, everything was already moving forward. His phone now held a full 20-minute video showing every detail of the harassment. His briefcase held business cards from 3 passengers who had watched the entire incident and offered to be witnesses. And his notebook contained careful, detailed notes about the officers' behavior, what they said, how they acted, and exactly which security rules they broke. But Judge Williams wasn't done, not even close. During the flight, he used the airplane Wi-Fi to look up Officer Rodriguez and Supervisor Pierce. What he found made his jaw tighten with an anger he didn't often show. Pierce had already been the subject of 4 complaints for discriminatory screening. All 4 complaints came from Black or Hispanic travelers, and every single one had been dismissed as unsubstantiated through the airport's internal review process. To anyone who knew what to look for, the pattern was obvious. Rodriguez didn't look any better. He had been connected to 3 similar incidents in the past 2 years. Each time, minority travelers were singled out for intense screening that led to nothing. Each time, those travelers complained, and each time, the complaints disappeared into a system designed to protect officers, not stop misconduct. By the time Judge Williams' plane landed, he had already built a full strategy in his mind. This was not going to be a simple complaint filed through normal channels and then quietly forgotten. This was going to be a full dismantling of the system that had allowed Rodriguez and Pierce to operate without consequences for years. He called his wife from the airport and told her what happened. She wasn't shocked. As a successful Black attorney, she had experienced similar treatment herself while traveling. But what did surprise her was the force in her husband's voice. She knew that tone. It was the same tone he used in court right before delivering a sentence that changed someone's life. Judge Williams checked into his hotel and spent the evening preparing, not for his conference presentation, which he had given many times, but for the war he was about to launch against institutional racism inside airport security. He wrote a detailed timeline of events and matched it with timestamps from his video. He researched federal laws about airport security procedures and constitutional protections against unreasonable searches. He identified the specific policies Rodriguez and Pierce had violated, and he mapped out which legal remedies were available under federal law. Most importantly, he began contacting people in his network across the federal judiciary and beyond. Judge Williams had spent 15 years building relationships with judges, law enforcement officials, civil rights attorneys, and media professionals. Now he planned to use every single one of those connections to make sure what happened to him would never happen to another innocent traveler. The next morning, he made one phone call that set everything into motion. He contacted the Office of the United States Attorney for the district where the airport was located. The prosecutor who took the call sounded doubtful at first. Airport security issues were usually treated as administrative problems, not federal criminal cases. But as Judge Williams explained what happened, especially the part about officers opening privileged legal materials and the clear pattern of targeting minority travelers, the prosecutor's tone changed completely. This wasn't just a complaint about rude treatment. This looked like possible evidence of a federal conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law. Within hours, FBI agents were reviewing security footage from the checkpoint. Federal prosecutors were digging into employment records connected to Rodriguez. Civil rights attorneys were preparing what would become one of the most serious discrimination lawsuits in airport security history. Pierce and Rodriguez had no idea what was coming. They went back to work the next day, assuming their encounter with a well-dressed black man was just another routine stop that would be forgotten in a week. They had no clue they had just handed a federal judge everything he needed to expose years of discrimination and abuse of power. Judge Williams spent the rest of that week building his case step by step. Every phone call had a purpose. Every document was examined carefully. Every piece of evidence was organized and cataloged with the precision of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. But what Rodriguez and Pierce still didn't understand was this. Their situation was about to get far worse, fast. The FBI investigation moved quicker than anyone expected. Agent Sarah Chen was assigned to the case, and she brought 15 years of experience investigating civil rights violations. What she discovered in the first 48 hours of reviewing airport footage made her stomach turn. The cameras had captured everything. It wasn't just Judge Williams' harassment. The footage showed months of similar incidents involving other travelers too. Pierce and Rodriguez had been repeatedly targeting well-dressed Black and Hispanic passengers, pulling them aside and putting them through invasive searches that white travelers simply weren't facing. The pattern was so clear that Agent Chen couldn't help but wonder how it had been missed for so long. That answer came as soon as she dug into the airport's complaint system. Every complaint filed against Rodriguez over the past 3 years had been handled by the same administrator, Tom Bradley. And it quickly became obvious that Bradley had made it his personal job to protect these officers from consequences. He dismissed complaints without real investigations. He wrote incident reports in a way that downplayed the officers' behavior. He even coached Rodriguez on how to write statements that avoided admitting wrongdoing. What Agent Chen had found wasn't just personal racism from a few officers. It was institutional corruption, built to support that racism, hide it, and keep it running. At the same time, Judge Williams was making moves of his own. He reached out to colleagues who had dealt with similar treatment while traveling. The stories he heard back were both heartbreaking and infuriating. Judge Patricia Washington from Chicago said she was pulled aside for extra screening every single time she flew, even though she had TSA pre-check. Judge Robert Martinez from Texas told Williams about officers insisting on searching through confidential court documents, calling them suspicious. Judge Angela Brooks from Florida said she had been patted down so often and so aggressively that she stopped flying to conferences altogether and started driving instead. And it wasn't only judges. It became clear that successful Black and Hispanic travelers were being targeted across the board. Doctors, lawyers, business executives, and anyone whose appearance didn't fit the stereotypes living in the minds of officers like Rodriguez and Pierce. Judge Williams gathered these accounts and turned them into a detailed report. He shared it with the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the Federal Aviation Administration. Then he leaked key parts of it to investigative journalists who had been covering discrimination in airport security for years. The media response hit fast, and it hit hard. National outlets picked up the story within days. Judge Williams' video became Exhibit A in a nationwide conversation about racial profiling in airport security. Cable news shows played the footage over and over, showing Rodriguez and Pierce treating a federal judge like a criminal suspect. The optics were brutal for the airport authority. Here was a respected jurist, someone who had spent his life upholding the law, being publicly humiliated by officers who couldn't even give one clear, legal reason for what they were doing. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Williams stayed calm, professional, and controlled, while the officers looked biased, defensive, and sloppy. Pierce and Rodriguez suddenly found themselves in a media storm they weren't ready for. That attitude lasted exactly 48 hours, because that's how long it took Agent Chen to show them what the FBI had uncovered. Suddenly, the airport authority changed its tone completely. They announced that Pierce and Rodriguez were being placed on administrative leave while a full investigation was conducted. They promised to review procedures. They talked about adding more training on bias prevention. They hired an outside consulting firm to perform a full audit of screening practices. But Judge Williams wasn't impressed. He had seen this playbook before. Institutions promise reform while the cameras are on. then quietly go back to normal once the attention fades. Williams didn't want damage control. He wanted accountability, real consequences, real change. Working with civil rights attorney Michelle Roberts, Judge Williams filed a federal lawsuit. It demanded both monetary damages and systemic reform. The lawsuit named Pearson Rodriguez personally, along with Tom Bradley and the airport authority itself. It alleged violations of the Fourth Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, and multiple federal civil rights laws. And the lawsuit didn't focus only on Williams. It laid out the experiences of dozens of other travelers who had been targeted by the same officers. It included statistical evidence showing Pearson Rodriguez searched black passengers at rates far beyond any reasonable security explanation. It documented how the airport authority knowingly ignored repeated complaints. But the most damaging part of all was still coming, because the lawsuit also included excerpts from internal emails and text messages Agent Chen had uncovered during her investigation. The messages were damning. They showed Pearson Rodriguez making openly racist comments about the passengers he was targeting. In some texts, he joked about making certain travelers miss their flights on purpose. Other messages made it clear that the harassment wasn't just unconscious bias, it was intentional and cruel. Rodriguez even wrote to a coworker that he enjoyed putting travelers in their place. Pierce sent texts complaining about fancy-dressed thugs, who in her words thought they were better than airport security officers. These messages were critical. They provided the kind of direct proof that civil rights cases rarely have, clear evidence of discriminatory intent, and things only got worse from there. During the legal discovery process, even more disturbing facts came out. Pearson Rodriguez had received performance reviews that actually praised them for being thorough in their screenings. Their supervisors knew about the repeated complaints, but treated them as signs the officers were doing their jobs well. Tom Bradley, the administrator who had dismissed the complaints, had even received bonuses that were partly based on keeping complaint numbers low. The system wasn't broken by accident. It was built to reward behavior that violated people's constitutional rights. Judge Williams gave his deposition with the same calm authority he showed in his courtroom. He walked the defense attorneys through every detail of what had happened at the airport. He cited exact times, named witnesses, and clearly explained how each action by Pearson Rodriguez violated established security rules. When Rodriguez's lawyer claimed the search followed standard procedures, Judge Williams gave that same quiet, dangerous smile Pierce had seen at the airport. Then he pulled out a thick binder, the official TSA guidelines, and began reading the exact sections Rodriguez had broken. He was prepared, and it showed. Pierce's deposition was even worse for the defense. Under questioning by civil rights attorney Michelle Roberts, Pierce admitted she had never received proper training on unbiased screening. She also admitted that most of her intense searches involved minority passengers. When asked to explain the huge imbalance, she claimed it was just a coincidence. That's when Roberts presented Pierce's own text messages, printed out, highlighted, and undeniable. Messages where Pierce had used racial slurs to describe passengers. Pierce's attorney objected again and again, but it didn't matter. The evidence was overwhelming. These weren't officers making honest mistakes. These were people abusing their authority to act on personal prejudice. The case never went to trial. Faced with evidence that would almost certainly lead to a massive jury verdict, the airport authority agreed to settle for $8.5 million. But for Judge Williams, the money wasn't the most important part. The settlement forced real change. Pierce, Rodriguez, and Tom Bradley were fired immediately. Mandatory bias training was ordered for all security staff. An independent oversight board was created to investigate discrimination complaints. Airports were required to track search statistics to catch bias early, before it became systemic. Judge Williams donated his share of the settlement to civil rights organizations working on airport security reform. He said money was never his goal. His goal was making sure no one else had to go through what he did. The impact of the case spread far beyond one airport. The Department of Transportation used the settlement as a model for reforms nationwide. Other travelers who had faced discrimination found lawyers willing to take their cases, knowing Judge Williams had set strong legal precedents. Pearson Rodriguez became unemployable in law enforcement or security. Their names were now permanently linked to racial profiling. Rodriguez eventually took a job as a warehouse security guard, earning far less than before. Pierce left the security field altogether and moved into retail management. Tom Bradley faced federal criminal charges for covering up civil rights violations. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. His conviction sent a clear warning to other administrators. Protecting discriminatory officers could cost you your freedom. But the most important result was cultural change. Judge Williams' willingness to fight back and the undeniable evidence he collected made it impossible for institutions to dismiss discrimination as isolated incidents. Other judges began speaking publicly about their own experiences. Professional organizations started tracking complaints and demanding reform. The legal community was forced to accept a hard truth. Even its most powerful members were not immune to the same treatment ordinary citizens had endured for years. Agent Sarah Chen continued investigating airports across the country. The methods she developed during this case became standard in civil rights investigations. She testified before Congress, pushed for stronger oversight, and helped draft new laws protecting travelers from discrimination. Judge Williams returned to his courtroom changed. He now had a deeper understanding of how institutional bias worked and how difficult it was for ordinary people to fight it. That perspective shaped his rulings, especially in cases involving police misconduct and civil rights violations. Judge Marcus Williams proved that justice sometimes requires more than wearing a robe. Sometimes it requires the courage to fight back when systems fail, and the determination to make sure your experience is the last time it ever happens. Rodriguez and Pierce thought they could intimidate a successful black man without consequences. Instead, they handed him everything he needed to tear down their entire system of discrimination and send a message that echoed through airports across the nation. This case was intense, but the next one? That one is even more unbelievable.